Welcome to Life Stories, where every tale uncovers courage, compassion, and the human spirit's resilience. In today's story, we meet Hannah Clark, a dedicated nurse whose ordinary life is upended when a powerful businessman, Robert Price, is rushed into her care. What begins as a fight to save his life soon becomes a battle against corruption, betrayal, and danger as Hannah uncovers a sinister conspiracy. Will her determination and love for justice prevail? Or will the shadows of deceit prove too strong? Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey of truth, bravery, and lessons that will inspire you. It was another typical morning at Riverside General Hospital. The kind of place where lives began, ended, and sometimes hung in a delicate balance. I was in the middle of my shift, moving briskly between patients and tasks. The hospital was alive with its usual rhythm, the constant hum of machines, the clipped tones of doctors barking out orders, and the comforting murmur of nurses soothing anxious families. For someone like me, who had worked here for years, it was almost like music, a strange, chaotic symphony that I had grown used to. My name is Hannah Clark. I'm 29 years old and a nurse, one of those professions people either admire or pity, depending on how much they understand the toll it takes. I take pride in my work, even though it's exhausting, both physically and emotionally. You don't just walk away from the hospital at the end of the day, you carry it with you, every patient, every family, every loss. But my life wasn't just about the hospital. Outside of it, I had my younger brother, Josh, to think about. He's 20, ambitious, and full of dreams about finishing college and making something of himself. Our parents passed away years ago, and I've been his guardian, his cheerleader, and sometimes, when life gets tough, his rock. Keeping up with the bills wasn't easy, though, and I'd be lying if I said the weight of it all didn't sometimes feel unbearable. That morning had been ordinary, right until it wasn't. I was busy restocking supplies when the PA system crackled, announcing a code blue in the emergency room. Moments later, one of the doctors, Daniel, rushed into the hall, calling for me. "Hannah, we need you now. ER. It's bad." I didn't hesitate. In this line of work, hesitation can cost lives. I ran toward the ER, already mentally preparing for the chaos I was about to face. What greeted me was nothing short of a storm: paramedics wheeling in a man on a stretcher, doctors shouting, nurses scrambling, controlled chaos, as we call it. The man on the stretcher was Robert Price, though I didn't know his name yet. What I did know was that he was in critical condition. Male, 55, one of the paramedics said as he handed over the patient report. Collapsed during a business meeting. Seizures on site. Lost consciousness in transit. The details didn't faze me, I've seen worse. But something about the man caught my attention. Despite his pale, unconscious state, there was a presence about him. As if even in his vulnerability, he was somehow larger than life. His suit was expensive. His watch even more so. Whoever he was, it was clear he wasn't just another patient. As we worked to stabilize him, I heard a woman's voice behind me. "That's Robert Price," she said. "He's the CEO of Price Global Enterprises." I turned to see a striking woman with blonde hair that was too perfect for the circumstances. She was composed. Too composed for someone whose stepfather had just been wheeled in half dead. "I'm Vanessa Price," she added. "Do whatever it takes." Her words were straightforward, but there was something in her tone that unsettled me, cold, clinical, as if this were a business transaction rather than a family emergency. I nodded and turned back to my work. Vanessa lingered for a moment before retreating to the corner of the room, where she stood with her arms crossed, observing everything with a detached air. The hours that followed were grueling. Robert's condition was touch and go for a while, but eventually, we managed to stabilize him and transfer him to the ICU. It was only after that, as I leaned against the cool hospital wall trying to catch my breath, that the weight of it all hit me. Vanessa approached me again. This time with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for what you've done for my stepfather," she said. "I can see he's in good hands." I started to respond. But before I could, she pulled out an envelope and held it toward me. "This is just a token of appreciation," she said, her tone silky and insistent. I stared at the envelope, then back at her. It was heavy, heavier than it should have been. My stomach churned. "That's not necessary," I said, keeping my voice polite but firm. "I'm just doing my job." Vanessa smiled again, this time a little tighter. "I insist," she said, placing the envelope in my hand before walking away, her heels clicking against the floor with a finality that suggested the conversation was over. I stood there for a long moment, the envelope in my hand like a weight I couldn't shake. When I finally opened it later that night, sitting at my small kitchen table, I wasn't surprised to find a thick stack of cash inside. It was more money than I made in a month. Maybe 2. Josh came into the kitchen just then, oblivious to my turmoil. "Everything okay?" he asked. I forced a smile and quickly tucked the envelope away. "Yeah," I said, though my voice felt hollow. "Just a long day at work." As Josh talked about his classes, his face animated and full of hope, I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it almost stole my breath. I knew I could use the money to help him, to pay some bills, to make our lives a little easier. But something about Vanessa and the way she had handed it to me didn't sit right. That night, lying awake in bed, I made a decision. I would return the money and look deeper into Robert Price's case. Something wasn't adding up, and my instincts were screaming at me not to let it go. Little did I know that decision would change my life and the lives of everyone around me forever. The morning air was crisp as I stepped into the hospital the next day. Despite the unease lingering from the previous evening, I pushed it aside and prepared for another shift. Robert Price's case weighed heavily on my mind, and Vanessa's cold demeanor haunted me more than I cared to admit. Something about the way she insisted on giving me that envelope, it wasn't just gratitude. It felt calculated, like a chess move in a game I didn't yet understand. I made my way to the ICU, where Robert had spent the night. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of monitors. His imposing frame, now weakened and pale, seemed out of place against the sterile white sheets. I checked his vitals, noting the subtle improvements in his condition. Still unconscious, his face bore a tension that suggested his body was fighting something unseen. Dr. Laura, the head of the ICU, walked in moments later. She had a calm presence that put everyone at ease, even in the most chaotic situations. "How's he doing?" she asked, her eyes scanning the monitors. "Stable. But something feels off," I replied. "It's like his body is responding, but not in the way I'd expect." She nodded thoughtfully. "We'll run more tests. Keep a close eye on him." I was about to leave when Vanessa entered the room. She carried a porcelain teacup, her polished appearance once again at odds with the somber atmosphere. "I brought something special for him," she said, placing the cup on the bedside table. "It's a family recipe. I thought it might help him recover faster." Dr. Laura glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "We need to be cautious about what he consumes," she said diplomatically. "I'll need to approve anything before it's given to him." Vanessa's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of irritation in her eyes. "Of course, Doctor. I only want what's best for him." After she left, I picked up the teacup, staring at the faint steam rising from its surface. My instincts screamed that something was wrong. I turned to Dr. Laura. "Do you think we should have this tested?" She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Can't hurt to be thorough." I took the cup to the hospital pharmacy, where Peter, a close friend and trusted pharmacist, worked. "Peter, I need a favor," I said, setting the cup on the counter. "Can you analyze this discreetly?" He raised an eyebrow, but the seriousness in my voice silenced any questions. "Give me a few days," he said. taking the cup with a small nod. That evening, as I replayed the day's events, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. I thought about Vanessa's calculated movements, her perfect composure, and the way she seemed more interested in appearances than her stepfather's well-being. There was a story there, one she was working hard to keep hidden. The next day, as I made my rounds, Vanessa arrived again, this time with a man in an expensive suit. He introduced himself as the family lawyer. Their hushed conversation near Robert's room caught my attention. So I lingered nearby, pretending to sort through files. "We need to act fast," Vanessa, the lawyer, said in a low voice. "If he doesn't sign those documents soon, the entire plan falls apart." "I know that," Vanessa snapped. "But how do you expect me to get him to sign anything when he's barely conscious?" I froze, my heart racing. What documents? What plan? Their words only deepened my suspicions. By the end of my shift, I was more convinced than ever that something sinister was at play. My thoughts were interrupted when Peter called. "Hannah, you were right to be suspicious," he said, his voice grave. "The tea you gave me contained traces of a rare toxin, one that could easily explain Mr. Price's condition." I felt a chill run down my spine. Vanessa had brought that tea, insisting it was for Robert's recovery. But now I knew better. Someone wanted him sick, and Vanessa was at the center of it. That night, lying in bed, I realized I couldn't walk away from this. If Vanessa was willing to poison her stepfather, how far would she go to protect whatever she was after? I had no choice but to find out. The next morning, I couldn't ignore the growing weight on my chest. My instincts, honed by years of nursing and endless nights spent comforting patients and families, told me I was stepping into something far beyond my realm. But how could I ignore it? Robert Price was still lying unconscious, and the woman who claimed to care for him had likely poisoned him. If I didn't act, who would? When I arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. I made my way to the ICU, where Dr. Laura met me with a frown. "The lab confirmed it," she said, speaking in a hushed tone. "There's a toxin in his system. But it's rare, something I've never encountered before. It came from the tea Vanessa brought." I told her. "Peter found traces of it." Laura's expression darkened. "If that's true, this isn't just about negligence. It's attempted murder. We need to be careful. Hannah, this family has power. They could bury us if we're not careful." The warning only solidified my resolve. I don't care how powerful they are. We owe it to him to find out the truth. Later that day, Vanessa returned to the hospital, this time with an air of urgency. She brought another cup of tea, which I intercepted at the door. "We're monitoring his diet closely," I told her, trying to sound neutral. "I'll need to check with the doctor before giving him anything." Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Of course," she said, her voice as smooth as silk. "I just want to help him recover." I placed the cup on a nearby tray and watched as Vanessa retreated down the hall, her perfect composure never faltering. Something about her made my skin crawl, but I couldn't let my emotions cloud my judgment. I needed facts. Proof, something concrete to stop her. That evening, I got my chance. Peter called with the results from the second cup of tea. "Same toxin," he said. "Whoever's behind this is using small doses, just enough to make him weak without killing him outright." The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was deliberate, calculated, and cruel. The next day, Vanessa appeared again, this time with a man in a tailored suit who introduced himself as the family's lawyer. Their conversation took place just outside Robert's room, and while I pretended to organize supplies nearby, I couldn't help but listen. "We're running out of time," the lawyer said in a low, urgent tone. "He needs to sign the transfer documents. If he doesn't, we'll lose everything." Vanessa let out an irritated sigh. "I know. But he's still too weak to hold a pen, let alone understand what he's signing." That's not an excuse, the lawyer snapped. We need this done before the board gets suspicious. My stomach twisted. I didn't know exactly what they were planning. But it was clear they were after more than just Robert's health. His signature on whatever documents they were talking about was the key to their plan. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions and theories. None of them comforting. What if Vanessa and the lawyer succeeded in their plan? What if Robert never woke up to defend himself? I knew I couldn't let it happen. The next morning, I made up my mind to dig deeper. Even if it meant stepping into dangerous territory. My first stop was Peter's lab, where I collected samples of the tea and the toxin reports. Then, I reached out to a trusted colleague, Daniel, who had connections outside the hospital. I need your help, I told him, showing him the lab results. Something's happening, and I think it goes deeper than just the poisoning. Daniel studied the papers. His brow furrowed. This is serious. Hannah, if what you're saying is true, you're dealing with more than just a family feud. This could get dangerous. I know, I said, my voice steady. But someone has to protect him. Daniel nodded, his expression resolute. Then let's do this right. Together. We began piecing together the fragments of a sinister puzzle, one that would lead us to a truth far darker than either of us could have imagined. The following days felt like walking a tightrope, each step more precarious than the last. Vanessa's visits to the hospital became increasingly frequent, her demeanor growing colder with each passing moment. She wasn't just a worried stepdaughter, she was orchestrating something. And the pieces were falling into place far too neatly. Daniel and I spent hours after our shifts piecing together the puzzle. We pored over the toxin reports, reviewed Robert's medical records, and even quietly interviewed staff members who had interacted with Vanessa. What emerged was a chilling narrative. Someone was systematically weakening Robert. And the motive was power, control over his vast empire. One evening, as we sat in a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria, Daniel leaned in, his voice low. I did some digging, he said, sliding a folder toward me. Vanessa and her lawyer have been trying to push through a series of board-level changes at Price Global Enterprises. They're trying to consolidate power, but they need Robert's signature to finalize it. My hands trembled as I opened the folder. Inside were documents detailing board meeting minutes, legal filings, and financial transactions. It was clear, Vanessa wasn't just poisoning her stepfather out of spite. She was orchestrating a hostile takeover. She's running out of time. Daniel continued. The board is starting to ask questions. If Robert doesn't recover soon, the whole plan falls apart. The implications were staggering. Vanessa wasn't just dangerous, she was desperate. And desperate people made mistakes. That night, I found myself back at Peter's lab, reviewing the toxin analysis yet again. This substance, Peter explained, pointing to the report, isn't just rare, it's practically impossible to get without serious connections. We're talking international black market level access. The gravity of his words sank in. Vanessa wasn't acting alone. She had resources, connections, and a network that extended far beyond what I had imagined. The next day, things took a darker turn. Vanessa arrived at the hospital accompanied by a private doctor and a small entourage of suited men. Their presence sent a chill through the ICU. We're transferring my stepfather to a private clinic, she announced, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Dr. Laura stepped forward, her calm demeanor masking the tension in the room. Mrs. Price, I can't authorize a transfer in his condition. Moving him now could be fatal. Vanessa's smile was ice cold. Then I'll have my legal team take it up with the hospital administration. As the argument escalated, I slipped away, my heart pounding. If Vanessa succeeded in transferring Robert, we would lose all control over his care and any chance of stopping her plan. I found Daniel in the hallway, explaining the situation in hurried whispers. She's trying to move him out of our reach, I said. We can't let it happen. Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. I'll talk to the hospital's legal team. They need to stall her. At least for now. While Daniel worked to buy us time, I returned to Robert's room, only to find him more restless than before. His eyelids fluttered. And for a moment, I thought he might wake. I leaned in, hoping to catch any words he might say. Safe, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Office, home. My breath caught. Was he trying to tell me something? A safe in his home office? Could it be connected to Vanessa's plan? I didn't have long to ponder. Moments later, Vanessa stormed into the room, her lawyer close behind. What are you doing in here? She demanded, her tone sharp. Checking his vitals. I replied evenly, masking the unease her presence always brought. She stared at me for a long moment before finally speaking. I hope you're not overstepping. Nurse Clark. You wouldn't want to get involved in things you don't understand. Her words were a warning, but I refused to let fear take root. As she left, I felt a renewed determination. Whatever Robert had meant with his cryptic words, I would find out. The following night, Daniel and I sat in his apartment, mapping out a plan. We need to get into that safe, I told him, the words feeling both reckless and necessary. It's risky, Daniel said, his brow furrowed. If Vanessa catches wind of this. I know, I interrupted. But if we're going to stop her, we need proof, real proof. This might be our only chance. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Okay, let's do it. As we prepared for what felt like a dangerous game of chess, I couldn't shake the feeling that every move we made was being watched. We were walking into a storm, and there was no turning back now. The plan was reckless, bordering on foolish, but we didn't have a choice. If Robert Price's cryptic words about the safe in his home office meant anything, they could be the key to unraveling Vanessa's scheme. Daniel and I agreed to move quickly. Every moment we delayed, Vanessa tightened her grip, and Robert's condition grew more precarious. We arrived at the Price family mansion under the cover of night. It loomed against the dark sky, its grandeur only adding to the foreboding feeling in my chest. Vanessa's wealth was on full display: manicured gardens, gleaming windows, and security cameras perched like watchful sentinels. I couldn't help but think how out of place Daniel and I were. Two ordinary people stepping into a world of power and danger. Daniel had managed to get us access through a contact, a former security contractor who still had connections to the estate staff. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. As we slipped through the side entrance, my pulse raced. The silence inside the mansion was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of distant machinery. Every creak of the floorboards felt like it might give us away. Stay close, Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. He carried a small flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as we navigated the labyrinthine hallways. We found the office exactly where we expected it, tucked away behind an ornate double door. Inside, the room was everything I imagined: rich mahogany shelves lined with leather-bound books, a massive desk polished to a gleaming shine, and art pieces that probably cost more than my annual salary. But my focus was on the far wall, where a discreet panel stood out ever so slightly. Daniel approached it first, running his fingers along the edges. Here, he said softly, pressing on the panel. It shifted under his touch, revealing a digital safe. My breath hitched. This has to be it, I whispered. But there was a problem. The safe required a code. I racked my brain, trying to recall anything Robert had said. Then it hit me, the photograph on his desk at the hospital. The one with a date etched into the frame. Try July 15th, 1985, I said, my voice trembling. Daniel punched in the numbers, and with a soft click, the safe opened. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. Inside were stacks of documents, USB drives, and a notebook. We began photographing everything, knowing time wasn't on our side. Each page told a damning story, fraudulent contracts, offshore accounts, and even a few names I recognized: politicians, business leaders, and, of course, Vanessa. "This is it," Daniel said, his voice taut with urgency. "It's everything we need." As I reached for a small USB drive nestled among the papers, the sound of footsteps froze us both. The door creaked open, and there stood Vanessa. Her perfect composure was gone, replaced by raw fury. "Well, well," she said, her voice low and venomous. "I knew you were trouble, Nurse Clark. But breaking and entering? That's bold." My heart pounded as Vanessa stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. I could feel Daniel tensing beside me, ready to act if things escalated. "You have no idea what you're meddling with," she hissed. "Put everything back. Walk away. And maybe I'll forget this ever happened." "I can't do that," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "You're poisoning your stepfather, trying to steal everything he built. I won't let you get away with it." Vanessa's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might lunge at me. Instead, she smiled, cold and calculating. "You're in over your head, little nurse. But since you're so eager to play hero, let's see how you handle this." Before I could react, she turned and shouted, "Security!" Panic surged through me. Daniel grabbed my arm. "We have to go. Now." We bolted, clutching the USB drive and our phones filled with photos. Behind us, I could hear the pounding of footsteps and Vanessa's furious commands. The maze of hallways blurred together as we ran, adrenaline propelling us forward. We barely made it out through the side entrance, slipping into the shadows before the guards could catch up. As we sped away in Daniel's car, the mansion disappearing in the rearview mirror, I clutched the USB drive tightly. My hands were shaking, but my resolve was stronger than ever. "We have what we need," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "This changes everything." But as I glanced at him, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. We had crossed a line, and there was no turning back now. Whatever came next, I had to be ready for Robert, for Josh, and for the truth. The drive back to Daniel's apartment was quiet, the tension between us thick as we processed what had just happened. The USB drive felt like a ticking time bomb in my hands, heavy with the weight of its secrets. We had risked everything to get it, and now we had proof of Vanessa's crimes and her network of corruption. But proof was only the beginning. What came next could either dismantle her empire or destroy us in the process. Daniel pulled into the parking lot, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "We need to secure this," he said, his voice firm. "And we need to contact someone we can trust." I nodded, my mind racing. Detective Michael Carter came to mind immediately. He'd been investigating corruption cases for years and had a reputation for being relentless. If anyone could help us navigate this, it was him. Inside Daniel's apartment, we plugged the USB drive into his laptop. The screen lit up with folders, each meticulously labeled with dates and names. As we clicked through the files, the depth of the conspiracy became clear. There were records of bribes, shell companies, offshore accounts, and names of people in positions of power, from local officials to international business moguls. "It's worse than I thought," Daniel said, scrolling through the documents. "This isn't just about Price Global Enterprises. This network spans across industries, construction, pharmaceuticals, even politics." A chill ran down my spine. Vanessa wasn't just trying to take control of her stepfather's company. She was a key player in a much larger operation, one that thrived on greed and corruption. As we worked, my phone buzzed on the table. It was Josh. My stomach twisted as I saw his name. I hadn't told him anything about what was happening, trying to shield him from the danger. But now, seeing his name on the screen, I felt the weight of my decision to keep him in the dark. "Hey, Josh," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, Hannah," he said. His voice light but tinged with concern. "Are you okay? You've been acting different." I forced a smile. Even though he couldn't see it. "I'm fine. Just busy with work." There was a pause. And then he said, "You know you can tell me if something's wrong, right?" I wanted to tell him everything. To let him share the burden I was carrying. But I couldn't. "Not yet. I know. Joff. Thanks. I'll call you tomorrow." "Okay. Okay," he said. Though I could hear the doubt in his voice. "Stay safe." After I hung up, Daniel glanced at me. "You should tell him eventually. He's smart. And he'll figure it out." "I know," I said quietly. "But the less he knows right now, the safer he is." We spent the rest of the night organizing the evidence, pulling together a timeline of Vanessa's actions and the network's operations. By dawn, we had enough to take to Detective Carter. The meeting with Carter later that day was tense. He listened intently as we laid out what we'd found, his expression growing grimmer with every passing minute. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. "This is huge," he said. "And dangerous. If you're right about this network, they won't go down without a fight." "We know," I said. "But we can't let them get away with this." Carter nodded. "We'll need to move carefully. I'll assemble a task force. But it'll take time. In the meantime, you two need to lay low." As we left Carter's office, I felt a mix of relief and dread. We'd taken the first step. But the road ahead was treacherous. Vanessa and her network wouldn't go quietly, and I knew the danger would only escalate. That night, as I sat in my small apartment, I stared at the photos we'd taken of Robert's safe, the documents, and the faces of the people complicit in this sprawling conspiracy. I thought about Josh, about Robert still lying unconscious in the ICU, and about the lengths Vanessa had already gone to. She wouldn't stop. And neither could I. The storm we had unleashed was only beginning, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. As the storm finally settled, justice prevailed. Vanessa and her network of corruption were exposed. Their empire dismantled piece by piece. Robert Price awoke, weak but grateful, ready to rebuild his life and make amends for the shadows cast by his empire. For Hannah, the journey had changed everything. She had uncovered strength she didn't know she possessed, protected her brother Josh, and brought down a web of lies that had ensnared so many. But this wasn't just a story about defeating corruption. It was a story of resilience, love, and the courage to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more tales of triumph, compassion, and lessons that resonate far beyond the screen. Stay tuned for our next story, where every life has a tale worth telling.